Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to see you. We hope you had a joyful and meaningful Passover. I am David Rayfield. I am the co-founder and executive director of the Jewish Grandparents Network and Zaidi to Bina and Hallel. We are delighted to welcome Alicia Jo Rabins, who will present on when to speak our mind or when to hold our tongues, Jewish tools for navigating family relationships. I will introduce Alicia in a moment, but first I'd like to thank Zoe Fleischer, who does a marvelous work in producing these webinars, Sarah Lee Reed, who provides invaluable support, and I'd also like to welcome Miriam Brousseau, who is our wonderful partner from Tiny Windows Consulting. Some basic technical details. Please be sure to mute your microphones to avoid background noises such as dogs, lawnmowers, or low-flying airplanes. We hope you will participate in this evening's program, and we invite you to ask questions or share your thoughts by posting them in the chat box or raising your virtual Zoom hand, which you can find by clicking the reactions button on the bottom of your screen. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Alicia Jo Rabins. Alicia is a writer, a musician and performer and Torah teacher. She's a creator and performer of Girls in Trouble, an indie folk song cycle about women in Torah with accompanying curriculum, as well as the award-winning independent film, A Kaddish for Bernie Madoff. Alicia holds an MA in Jewish Women's and Gender Studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a Master's in Fine Arts and Poetry from Warren Wilson, and has prepared over 100 B'nai Mitzvah for their ceremonies, many of which she has officiated. She's the author of Even God Had Bad Parenting Days, a book about early parenting and Jewish spirituality, as well as 2 poetry books. She lives in Portland, Oregon, with her husband and 2 children, and true to her home in Portland, she is also an avid coffee drinker and plant lover. We hope you will continue to learn from Alicia by purchasing her book, which we will place a link of in the chat box. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Alicia Jo Rabins.
Hi, everyone. It's really an honor to get to speak with you today. And I am at my home in Portland, Oregon, where it's been alternately hailing and sunny all day and some confusing spring weather. So I just want to start by thanking you for being here and thanking the Jewish Grandparents Network for hosting this session. And I want to say that I am not a grandparent, and so I'm not pretending to be teaching you how to do your jobs as grandparents. Rather, I'm meeting you as a fellow steward of young people in various roles to look at some of the Jewish texts that I, as an educator, had encountered earlier, but when I became a parent 11 years ago, actually this weekend was her birthday, I started to find that these texts were actually very specifically helpful to me in thinking through some of the dilemmas and challenges of being a parent. And I can only imagine that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of difference with being a grandparent. And so what I would love to do during this next hour is to invite you to really have a conversation with me. I'm going to keep it to the chat for about the first 40 minutes. And then there'll be a Q&A towards the end where I'd really welcome also voices. But please chime in as much as you'd like on the chat, because I would love this to be a conversation among all of us, it's not a lecture, it's me bringing some thoughts and ideas and then brainstorming along with you how they might apply to our lives. I'm really interested in applied spirituality. So how can our traditions be not just kind of old legends, but things that actually, wisdom that actually helps us in our extremely personal daily lives, problems large and small. And I love how our tradition acknowledges that life is very complicated and we're all kind of muddling through. And so I really appreciate the support that we get. So that's what I'm here to kind of bring in today. If you don't understand anything I say, please feel free to ask in the chat and I will do my best to clarify it. So I wanted to start with a very brief little prompt. And please also feel free to put your name and where you're zooming in from in the chat if you'd like to just introduce yourself. And as we're sort of opening, I would love to hear any family relationships from the Torah or Jewish legends or Jewish stories that come to mind for you if you're just thinking about like a parent-child relationship or a sibling relationship, maybe a famous one. Maybe you happen to know one that's not so famous. Maybe you just know the names and there's still some curiosity about what's going on with them. But I would love to hear if any specific family relationships come to mind when I give you that prompt. And I also love seeing people's names as you come up. Hello, Chevy. So any like forefathers, foremothers, moments that they interacted with each other or their kids or their parents. I'm just curious if there's any kind of floating ancestors in people's minds who might want to be invited down into our conversation. Hi, Grandma Martha. Hi, Dory.
I
Hi,
see
Roberta.
Cain and Abel from
Cain and
Roberta.
Abel. Yeah, so Cain and Abel from Roberta. Thank you so much. Such a tragic story about these siblings. And one of the things I think about with Cain and Abel is that they were the first human kids of a human, right? According to our legends. So their mother, Eve, had to raise them with no experience herself of what it felt like to grow up as a human and be in relationship to family. And I always think about how that might have been a challenge for everyone in that family. I think they set the bar very low for what sibling relationships might look like, and very, I think there's so much space for the reality of challenging sibling relationships, either in our lives or in other generations of our families. So I'm seeing some wonderful. So hi, Diane. Thank you for being a fan of my film. Beth from Seattle always wonders about how Abraham and Sarah parented together. So interesting. And we have these moments when Abraham is commanded by God to potentially offer their son up on the mountain, and Sarah's not really in that story. So what does that say about their parenting? What does that say about Sarah's experience? Really interesting questions. I'm seeing some wonderful locations here. And the idea of Joseph, Ricky mentioned the idea of Joseph being the favorite son. So he has all these brothers, but he's the favorite. He gets that fancy Technicolor dream coat, right? He gets his fancy coat. And because of that jealousy, their family's really torn apart, right? The brothers really turn on him and put him in a pit and sell him into enslavement. And it ends up being very foundational to our story. We just celebrated Passover, some of us. So the story of ending up down in Egypt actually is related to that moment, which also I think can have a little bit of a hint towards how sometimes really challenging relationships can actually develop into quite beautiful relationships, sometimes decades down the road, which is what ends up happening with Joseph and his brothers later. Okay, so Miriam, who's also moderating, hello. So Miriam's namesake Miriam and her brothers Moses and Aaron. So this is further from, so we were talking about some Genesis families at the very beginning. And then at the end of the period of enslavement in Egypt, this three sibling family of Miriam, Moses, and Aaron end up getting really important responsibilities, each of them, in terms of leading their people. And there are moments of some tension, and there are also moments of great care where, for example, Miriam's watching over her little baby brother as he's floating down the Nile and keeping him safe. So we have like the complexity of a lot of love and allegiance, and also there are moments when there is tension between them. Cain and Abel and Joseph and his brothers. All right. Carol Lee and Joe mentioned Moses and Aaron, and then Moses and his wife, Zipporah, later on. And then, hi, Marta. And Doris mentions Isaac and Esau. So, right, Jacob and Esau and their father Isaac, and a lot of really difficult intergenerational stuff there with who's going to get the birthright. There's some really wild allegiance with their mom wanting a different brother to get the blessing and the birthright and tricking Isaac. And Rachel and Leah, beautiful, also very complex relationship between two sisters who, one of whom, Rachel, is described as very beautiful, seems to be very beloved, and Leah is described as having soft eyes, whatever that means. And it seems that she is not quite as favored, and that's really challenging. And they end up marrying the same man and then having a competition, sort of this, rivalry about who's going to have the most children. So, and King David's children. So thank you so much for generating these, calling down our ancestors and our great, 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 great mythic grandparents, potentially. And I just want to kind of expand our minds of what family is from, our kind of like desires for everybody to get along all the time and everything to be great, and to expand it to this actually quite profoundly complex and really challenging view of family that our ancient texts give us. And I personally think that there's something so beautiful in being given the permission to have complicated relationships. I think if our text had all these perfect people saying, oh yes, of course, mother, let me go off and do that. I'm like, oh, sister, I would never betray you. I think that would set an expectation for human behavior that is impossible. And instead, what we're given is a reflection of humans at our best and humans at our worst, precisely in family relationships. And sometimes I remind myself of that when I'm having a challenging moment, even as a parent, that this is not some kind of personal problem. I mean, it may be also personal, but it's not just personal. It's also structural. And it's something that is just a part of the journey of being human. And I'm very grateful to the compassion of our texts in portraying that for us. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a couple moments in the Jewish tradition that have two very different perspectives on the experience of being an ancestor, being a parent or a grandparent. So first, there is a quote from Genesis where God is making this beautiful promise to Abraham, saying, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens. So I'll just read it one more time and then we can probably take it down so we can see each other. I, God, will make your descendants, Abraham, as numerous as the stars of the heavens. So first of all, as a poet, that's just such a beautiful image of imagining a human looking out at the stars, especially pre-industrial times when there wasn't a lot of light pollution. And just if you've ever been in the desert or at sea, just the incredible numbers of stars, and thinking, wow, one day that's going to be my legacy. Okay, so we can take that down for a second. And it's such a beautiful, positive blessing. And if anyone has any thoughts about it or emotions that it evokes in them, or ways that it actually relates, even though it's so mythic, if it relates in any way to the personal experience of being a grandparent, which I have not had, I'm really curious to hear that. And I also, God is speaking to Ishmael and Isaac's future descent, right? The line from like God speaking to Abraham and then speaking through all of the future generations that will come. I mean, poetically, that includes us, right? We are some of those stars in the sky if we are here as Jewish people. That Abraham was kind of starting something that he couldn't even, no one person's mind can comprehend their own. How tremendous the effect actually is of I would say putting in that labor of raising children and grandchildren, and then it goes on and on and on. And a reminder that the Middle East conflict is one of the relatives. Yeah, that's certainly one way of looking at it for sure. Oh, is one of relatives. Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, all human conflict too is one of relatives, I believe. Okay, so we have this beautiful blessing. It's one of the central blessings in Jewish tradition. It's a very positive take on being a parent or grandparent or ancestor. It's like the greatest blessing is to know that your descendants will be manifold. So then we have, a different take on what it means to be a parent or grandparent. And this is a rabbinic concept called Tsa'ar Gidul Banim. And it comes up in a few different places in Torah. This is one where it's Rashi commenting on Genesis, and when Adam and Eve are getting that curse from when they're leaving Eden, Rashi is commenting that the pain that they're going to have, because there's labor pains and then there's this other pain that's described. So what is the other pain? And Rashi brings this idea that the pain is the pain of raising children, translated here as trouble, but really the pain, the hurt of raising children. So we can take that slide down. And I find this to be very powerful, that our rabbis, who are so child positive and so family positive and have such deep respect for the practice of rearing children and put such a high value on people becoming parents, that they also have this concept of the pain of raising children. And I'm very interested to hear if that's something that you all think is relevant to your lives as grandparents, or if you think that's only a parent thing, or maybe it's to your adult children who are now parents, But I'm very curious as a parent myself, who has grandparents in our family, the pain of raising children. Does this commentary resonate with you at all? Or do you think that the pain of raising children stops at one generation? I'm so curious. And Judy says, as a genealogist, I'm documenting family members to honor them, and so they will not be forgotten if they lived before World War II. That's very beautiful. So the attention to descendants of like stars in the sky imagery, and the attention to our progenitors, our ancestors, are both, I think, equally sacred, right? Why pain? What about joy and blessings? Yes. So I think that's a very fair question from Carolee and Job. Why pain? What about joy and blessings? I bring this quote to counterbalance what I see as the dominant position in Judaism, which is that children are a blessing. And they are, clearly. It's like the greatest blessing in the world. And that's, that blessing from Abraham, that the quintessential blessing is to have children and to get to be a parent. I find it very interesting that they also pay attention that in the process of parenting, there is this pain. So I'm going to read some of these responses. So Robin says, it humbles us, and we need to recognize also that we can't control everything in our lives. I love that. And that maybe some of the pain is related to an attempt, a natural human attempt to want to control, even if it's to not see someone else suffer, but that learning to let go of that is part of learning to abate that pain. And Nancy says, pain continues, and so does the joy. It doesn't end as a grandparent. No more, see more, but less hands-on. Hope, the pain of raising children or being a grandparent is there as a portal through which we can awaken to become more authentic parents and grandparents. That is so beautiful and profound. So it's, in that case, maybe it's not even a negative. Maybe if we just had this sort of sugar-coated experience and nothing ever went wrong, that would mean that we're not actually waking up and experiencing some of the deeper spiritual lessons. That's what I take from this beautiful comment from Hope. And David says, to an extent, multi-generational dynamics can bring another whole dimension of complications and at time pain. Hope says we can become more conscious and more loving. And Marta is saying that the changing of the world so quickly is painful. It's painful to recognize what 2 generations down must navigate. But yes. And sometimes you share their pain, but since they're adults, so as a parent, you can no longer solve their problems for them. These are really, really beautiful, beautiful sharings. And Diane, that pain probably always accompanies the joy. It isn't always easy to watch beloved grandchildren being parented in ways that worry me sometimes. I can only imagine there must be a dual, as a parent, we try to do our best and worry that we're not. And then as a grandparent, to watch someone else being the parent, there must be a whole other level of pain there. Sandwich generation, having parents in their 90s, kids and their midlife crisis, watching grandkids, keeping my mouth shut and purse open was advice I was given, right? So, right there, and that does raise the question of like, how do we deal with this pain, right? How can we mitigate it for ourselves? How can we kind of care for ourselves while these experiences that are actually very triggering often, whatever generation we're in, are happening? Yes. And the fact that it is, Linda mentioned that it's the most important job we will ever have, and that is scary, and it makes us expect exceptional skills from ourselves. These are so, so beautiful. Yeah, and the idea that sometimes, especially grandparents, probably bite your tongue until it's pierced. So the pain also of holding back sometimes, right? There's the pain of knowing that you, and this happens as a parent too, and I imagine even more as a grandparent, it's not your place at that moment to be the person acting. And the bittersweetness of experiencing grandchildren becoming stronger and more independent as their interests and priorities shift away from us as grandparents to their lives as young adults. Yeah. Oh, I love that Martha mentions that she remembers how her grandmothers were with her and how she reacts with her grandkids. And so that genealogy is kind of these patterns, and I think ways in which, like I was saying before, we can kind of connect to our descendants and to our ancestors sometimes in really profound ways, even in the simplest moments. Quite beautiful. And is Janice saying that the need to praise is painful, or that it can be painful to find something to praise, which I could also imagine. So just the sort of, similarly to our brief tour led by you all of family relationships in Genesis and Exodus, and seeing how holding space for the love and the complexity, the challenge and the sort of failing each other and then finding repair, that we see that in our myths about family. I think that there's something to be said for remembering that Jewish tradition and rabbinic wisdom has space for absolutely acknowledging the tremendous blessing that it is to be a parent or a grandparent, to get to pass on our traditions, to get to care for people we love. And that at the exact same time, and maybe as some of you so beautifully said, because of how much we care, there can be a lot of pain in that process. And it can be the pain of watching someone we love suffer. It can be the pain of having to bite our tongue and hold back when we wish we could speak. It can be the pain of accidentally hurting someone, which happens all the time as a parent. And I can only imagine as of like trying to do your best to show up for someone else and realizing that I'll just speak personally, have, with all the best intentions, have hurt my child's feelings or misunderstood what they were trying to say and reacted too quickly, which is just going to always be a part of it. And I think that the blessing and the pain are inextricable. Beth, above all else, watching my son's children with love and wisdom is such a treat. So when my daughter and I quietly struggle, this is what I focus on. Right. And I love this perspective of also we can choose at any moment. I mean, I think sometimes there's a sort of like vision flip that even as a parent, I try to do, where if I get too deep in the struggle, I try to balance it out with that perspective of like focusing on the sweetness or returning to a moment of repair. And having permission for the struggle actually, I think, makes it easier to do that. Whereas if we're expecting things to be perfect, then that to me is a recipe for disaster. Okay, so I'd love to share another quote or another source with you. And I'm going to ask your patience on this one because it's a little bit wild. And I actually want to see if I can see if you, okay, right now I'm only seeing myself, which is fine because I'm a spotlight. So I can't see, but I'm curious how many of you are familiar with this diagram. I'm just going to say a few words of orientation. So this is called the Sfirot. And as you can see at the top, the 10 Sfirot, there are 10 of them. And it's a mystical diagram from Jewish mysticism. Probably originated this version in the 1500s with Rabbi Isaac Luria. And it's a diagram of the human soul, which is a reflection in the mystical view of God, right? Because in Genesis, it says that we're created in the image of God. So this is one kind of poetic way of interpreting that, is that what we have inside us is a reflection of the divine. And it's kind of mapped onto our body. And it's a little bit like the chakras, if anyone has done yoga or explored Eastern religions. So there are these energy centers, and they represent different parts of being human, different emotions, different strengths or weaknesses or sort of qualities. And so what I really want to talk about today, I'm going to give you a very brief orientation of where these go, but I'm only going to really talk about two of them. We're not going to go very deep into it. So the top three, there's a triangle, and those are kind of like they're like wisdom and insight. And so they're kind of above the head. They're like what we might think of as, the aura or our thoughts. It's not as embodied. Then the two that are kind of number 4 and 5, chesed on the right and gevura on the left. These are the two that I really want to focus on. And I'm not really going to go further than that, but the idea is that they're all connected and they all kind of have a relationship to each other. So we're going to focus on, just for a minute, on chesed and gevura. So chesed aligns with the right shoulder and the right side of the body. And gevura aligns with the left shoulder and the left side of the body. And there are these opposites that balance each other. So we need both equally. But if one is too strong, then we get kind of out of whack or out of alignment. And actually that next one down is kind of like the heart center. You can see it's right at the center of the image. And so it's kind of like where your solar plexus would be. And one thing I really love about this concept is, so chesed, the right side, represents loving kindness and generosity and overflowing positivity. If there were going to be one word for chesed, it would be yes. It's compassion, it's loving kindness, it's all that good, delicious, kind of warm stuff. And gevura on the left is boundaries, judgment, kind of walls, endings, saying no. And so no would kind of be the main word. If we wanted to balance, it would be yes and no. So I'm just going to look at this for one more second and just look one more time. So on the right side of is the side of yes and compassion, and the left side is the side of no and boundaries. And then I'm going to have, let's have this image go away, Miriam, so I can see everyone better. So I just want to see any, okay, great. Oh, so this is on the arch doors of Ricky's Reform Synagogue. Beautiful. Okay. So I know these concepts can be a little bit like, whoa, it's like a chart of the graph of the human soul, which is also God. But I actually think that in terms of applied practical mysticism, which I was kind of talking about before, I'm not really interested in concepts for the sake of concepts, but I'm interested in concepts that have been passed down for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, that can help us in like very nitty-gritty daily life. So the way they talk about chesed and gevura is that they have to be in balance, but they never reach a place of stasis. So we're constantly balancing between that yes and that no. And as a parent, this has helped me, I would say, more than any other Jewish concept, perhaps. And so I wanted to share it with you, even though it's a tiny bit esoteric. And I wanted to actually ask you, since I don't usually get to be around a bunch of grandparents all at once, whether this resonates with you as grandparents as well. So I'll just say a word about how I see it as a parent, and I'm very curious. I think it came up a little bit in terms of how people were saying biting the tongue, like biting your tongue is gevura. That's that left side of holding back, of restraint and boundaries. And kind of rushing in and caring for someone, that is the side of chesed. And the balance between these is actually really complicated, because I think sometimes as a parent, and it sounds like you all are saying potentially as grandparents too, the impulse to rush in and love on someone in your most kind of instinctual way can actually be unintentionally not the best thing at the moment. And using that restraint actually can be the most loving thing at the moment. Conversely, if you're with a kid, and especially like a young child who really needs to learn the boundaries to be safe. So if a kid runs into the street and you say no, and use a really strong voice, that is kind of the element of gevura, of boundaries and consequences. And you might kind of get up in their face and say like, you can never do that, because they can die from doing that. So the most important thing is to set this very firm boundary. And one of the amazing things the rabbis say is that each of these contains the other. So the overflowing loving kindness contains boundaries, and the boundaries contain loving kindness. And I think that stopping a kid from running into the street is a great example of a boundary containing love, right? And I think that sometimes actually holding oneself back is a great example also of that complicated relationship of like sometimes showing love through holding a boundary. It's actually, I mean, it sounds kind of simple. It's extremely complex. And I find it to just be very, very helpful as I'm navigating, when do I hold my tongue as a parent? When do I actually rush in? And so I'm very curious if that resonates. Bye, Diane. Nice to see you. The hardest kind of love often not appreciated. Would that be the kind of setting boundaries type love, Nancy? I'm curious if that's what you mean. And I would love to hear, this is a very hard question, but I'm curious if anyone has an actual moment in their grandparenting where they feel like they either successfully or wish they had done it differently in retrospect, but used either the right side of generosity, loving kindness, compassion, or the left side of boundaries, and or where they were both contained. I know it's a tricky question, but I just always love to see. Sometimes people come up with really interesting examples. And if you can't, that's totally fine. Sometimes there's no time to ponder, just act then deal later. Absolutely. I love that point. And I think that's part of, so the mystical understanding of this diagram is that it's constantly being alive is that energy moves through the spherot, through these energy centers. And so we're constantly rebalancing. So it's not like you better, I think it's a very anti-perfectionistic view, actually. It's not like you better analyze and do the exact right thing with the right proportion of boundaries and compassion. It's more like, oh, if something didn't work, then which needs to be brought in to balance it out? No one can ever convey the joy of grandparenting. I love that. That makes me very excited. I was I was warned there might be some challenging I was warned that there might be a lot of negative comments, and so far I'm actually hearing a lot of love. I very much welcome the negative comments too, but I'm delighting in all of them. I had an incident with my son, Doris said, son-in-law, in that I expressed concern for the safety of my grandson being too close to the edge of a swimming pool, but my son-in-law thought I was too concerned. It's such a common thing. It's such a daily interaction between parents, kids, grandparents, and it is such a good example of this balance between boundaries, loving kindness, getting involved, people setting boundaries, people kind of negotiating which needs to be done at the moment. And that is just that's one of the best examples of this that I've ever heard. And both of you might have your different perspectives on what the right amount is. And also it's something that we need to kind of investigate with ourselves sometimes, of like, where are my boundaries? When do I need to hold back for my own sake or for others' sake? Martha says that she's been doing Musar. So the balance of lots of areas is important. Yeah. And they're working on the soul. So working on myself is important in watching the kids and grandkids. That's very, very beautiful. Sometimes the response or lack of response is to the parents of your grandchildren. Exactly. So this applies, yeah, I would say it sounds like Patty's saying both to adult children or in-laws and to grandchildren. And I think it applies to all of us all the time. You know, I mean, when somebody, for example, is maybe like if I gave this talk and I went over by 20 minutes, that might feel to me like I'm being very generous with my time, but actually it's a lack of respect for the boundaries of what we've all sort of agreed on when we step into this space. So just everything from the most nitty-gritty to the most emotional, I think it can be very helpful to just think about like, where are the right boundaries and how can we hold that generosity in the appropriate way?
Someone private messaged me, I'm not sure if it was on purpose or not, but they said with very young grandchildren, all this balancing happens when discussing their approaches to child rearing, which I think is super relevant to these conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that reminds me again of the person who pointed out, Patty, who pointed out that sometimes it's really, this might be most negotiated in, you know, adult relationships with adult children about parenting. You learn what the boundaries are as grandparents by overstepping, you must respect them. So that is Gevura, right? That's that side of boundaries and a respect for boundaries. And then we have to say, what are our boundaries? What am I learning about other people's boundaries? And then there's the very difficult balancing act of how can I honor my own boundaries and honor this other person's boundaries. And like, I am not here to offer solutions, but I'm here to offer some ancient Jewish frameworks that I think, again, takes it a little bit less out of the, like, this is a personal conflict and this person and I don't get along or something, and helps us see how a lot of this is structural human relationship stuff that we all deal with. I can talk honestly with my daughter, but I have to be very careful with son-in-law because he gets defensive. Yeah, and I mean, that can apply with partners, it's not even just in different generations. Iris's daughter told her that she says should so much. So she said, I backed off on giving advice and think very carefully before I do. It is hard though, in the interest of your grandkid, what they eat, what time they go to bed, etc. I have to remember it's their kids. That's some beautiful Gevura of saying, like, I feel this love and I have my own experience and my desire to share that. And I'm going to balance that out with my awareness of this boundary. And the balancing act between mother and father can come again between grandma and grandpa. That's interesting, which brings me back to some of those earlier Sarah and Abraham question that somebody brought up of, like, what was their co-parenting like? What were our foreparents co-grandparenting like, right? I mean, like, what were the grandparents thinking when the, like, daughter-in-law is tricking Isaac into giving the blessing to the wrong kid by putting I don't know if you remember that story, but he doesn't have good eyesight. And so she covers Jacob's arms with like animal hides so that Isaac will think that he's really hairy and that he's Esau and gives him the blessing. And so there's just, it's like, wow, the intensity of those relationships and of thinking of it in an intergenerational way is really, really interesting. Like, what would the grandparents have been thinking? Fascinating. Robin says, boundaries seem harder with the in-law child than your own child. That's a really interesting point or observation. Yeah, and I also think that sometimes boundaries are determined in nuclear families, and then suddenly we, like, marry into these families where there may be very different ideas about what is an appropriate boundary and what's too close and what's not close enough. Meshing, yes, exactly. I'm saying what Nancy is saying. The meshing values of two different families, and even just looking at that in the Chesed and Gevura balance of some families lean a little more towards, like, space and boundaries and really show love through that, actually. And some families show love through being very present, Great. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Thank you for going with me into this really wild, mystical world. It's pretty advanced and you did really beautifully. And now I want to go to a much more kind of simple ethical quote that also has a lot of deep complexity to it. So this is from, actually, let's see. Yes, that's right. Okay, so this is from the Talmud, and it's very gendered language. It's very, very ancient. If it's okay, I'd love to just sort of forgive that part of it and say, this is from, this was written down around the year 500 after being passed down orally until that. So it's 1500 plus years old. So it's not going to meet necessarily contemporary gender standards. But what I love about this is that this is the basic list of what a parent has to offer their child according to the Talmud. So, this Talmudic source says and a father is obligated to his son. So I'll say a parent is obligated to their child. So to circumcise him. Okay, so that's very literal. I would translate that as, like, give them some sense of their identity, of their Jewish identity, right? Whatever, it can literally be circumcision. It can be lighting Shabbat candles once in a while, telling them about Judaism, but let them know who they are. And to redeem him, if he's a firstborn son who must be redeemed. So, okay, that's pretty nitty gritty. We're not going to worry about that. To teach him Torah. So to give this child some sense of their heritage and ancestry. To marry him off, which I would say, I would rewrite personally as to teach them healthy relationships, right? So maybe that's getting married, maybe that's choosing to be single, but to have healthy, romantic, and intimate relationships. To teach them a trade. So financial health, of some sort, right? So we're not necessarily teaching them to be cobblers, but financial health. And then some say also to teach him to swim. So I love to teach him to swim because it seems like such a little side thing, but it's like, you know what? Surviving is important. Being in the natural world is important. And I love that what does not show up on this list is like, make them happy all the time. Make sure they never suffer, right? Give them everything they need and make sure they're not disappointed. Yeah, and Patty points out the Talmud doesn't mention love, right? There are other places that talk about love, but in a kind of like, what do you need to check off to see that you've done your job? I think it's really interesting that it's pretty externalized. So I just wanted to give you about a moment. If you were to have a list for grandparent obligations, and it doesn't have to be based on this, it's literally what you think if you were giving your wisdom, you could just drop in the chat, what would be one or two of your obligations that you think every grandparent should do for their grandchild?
And this might be a great time to shift to Q&A if maybe some folks want to say it out loud, and then we can sort of shift to some questions. Does that sound okay, Alicia?
That sounds great, yeah. And I do have one more text if we get to it. If we don't, that's totally great. So Hope, teaching a child to swim, metaphorically, could mean to be able to hold the good and the bad together in life, the light and the dark. That is so beautiful. Unconditional acceptance. Ricky, and I'm curious, do you mean teaching a grandchild that they are unconditionally accepted, or also how to unconditionally accept others, or both? I would love to hear. And Karen has a great question. What did love mean to Hebrew men 1,500 years ago? You know, the word love, I mean, we say in the Via Hafta, part of the Shema, that we're supposed to love God with all of our heart. There is a concept of love, right? And it may not be the same kind of romantic love, but in terms of that kind of allegiance and familial love, I feel like they had that too. But it is interesting that they didn't put that in this list. Love them, teach them to love and be and do kindness, says Carol Lee, and morality values. So we have some ethic. So we have kind of a combination of actual kind of ethical values and just love. And for grandparents to be there when needed.
David messaged me, teaching them family stories, both the good and the difficult.
Beautiful. Empathy. Oh, this is such a beautiful list. I feel like it'd be so amazing to kind of type all these up and have like the collective wisdom of this group of what grandparents should offer. Empathy, acceptance, longitudinal family history and values, and how to adapt to support our children and grandchildren physically, emotionally, spiritually. And Will says to teach them how to navigate in this new world. Be a mensch, says Janice. And Beth says, offer our grandchildren safety, unconditional love and support, babysitting, listening, and to enjoy all things. So again, this balance of teaching them how to have pleasure, right? How to see the world, see the beauty in the world, and also keeping them safe, which I would say is a little bit back to that kind of chesed and gevura balance of sometimes it's giving things and sometimes it's teaching them skills. Trying to mesh different families, Shirley says, through marriage requires a lot of understanding, compromise, and communication. Then when children are introduced into the equation, it's a whole lot more needed. Absolutely. So I hear in this list of grandparently, I don't know if I want to say obligations, but suggestions. So working on our own, understanding, compromise, and communication. It sounds like the more we can develop those skills, the more we can be in positive relationship with each other. Providing emotional strength during difficult times. It's really beautiful, Patty. Meshing with blended families and multifunctional families. Love and acceptance, be a mensch, enjoy together. Mental health issues, right? So giving support, sometimes beyond even what you can give, right? Sometimes that means facilitating other kinds of support. And making sure you know they are there for them, right? Being able to talk openly about our challenges, including mental health challenges, which I think previous generations weren't necessarily as comfortable doing. I think our whole society is kind of growing into that. So as we move into the full-on Q&A, like ask me anything, I do want to just share this one last, I'm going to read Lynn's comment and then we'll share this one last little source. So Lynn says that she did not have enough close relationships with Lynn's grandparents. So I feel I want to give an extra level for their self-esteem, wisdom, acceptance, tolerance, and fun. Be a trusted adult. I love that perspective that also we can heal some of that ancestral trauma or lack or just misalignment forward, right? We can redefine what our family story is going to be. Trust, time with our grandchildren, encourage them to make the world a better place. Grandparent-grandchild road trips. So I'd love to just share this last, not to stop the discussion, but to throw this into the discussion as one last rabbinic advice that I love, which is from Pirkei Avot, which is a list of kind of ethical advice from the Mishnah. This Rabbi Tarfon used to say, the work is not yours to complete, but you're not free to walk away from it either. There's a song that goes, Lo alecha hamlecha likmor. So you might have heard that. So I'm just going to read that one more time and then we can take it down. The work is not yours to complete. And he's speaking to all of us, but you're not free to walk away from it either. So we can close that slide, but I wanted to bring that voice of all of us being part of a bigger picture, sort of back to that sphere map of everything being connected and parts of a whole. And, you know, we're a link in a chain. And our relationships change as the generations continue, right? Where we're the kids, and then we're the parents, and then we're the grandparents, then we'll be great-grandparents. And even when we're not here anymore, we'll be the ancestors. And that on one hand, we have this beautiful list of suggestions for grandparents that you all have just gorgeously created and generated. And on the other hand, each one of us is a part of a bigger picture, and none of us can provide all of these things. And it's, in fact, our tradition explicitly says it's not our job. It's not our job to do it all ourselves and make sure we're the best grandparent who's ever lived and we meet every single need. But we are part of something bigger, and it's not our job to finish it. And we also aren't free to walk away from it. Karen says that they're producing an episode of Grand Central Radio call-in radio style podcasts, call-in radio show style podcasts about blended families. And there's an email for how you can join in that conversation. Speaking of being bigger than any one of us, right? That the work is not ours to complete. Shirley says, I never had the privilege of knowing any grandparents, all died in the Holocaust. So having close relationships with my own grandchildren is such a blessing. That's extremely beautiful. That's so beautiful. And it sounds like there's so much positivity and love in those relationships, Shirley, and that you've done such a beautiful job of creating that.
I'd love to invite folks to unmute a bit. We have about 8 minutes or so. So if you want to use the reactions to raise your hand, we'd love to hear from you vocally and get to talk. We'll spotlight you. You can talk directly with Alicia. These are such wonderful thoughts. It'd be great to hear them in your own voice if you are willing.
Yes, and feel free to ask me if you want any clarification or anything like that. I'm answering a direct message really quickly. In fact, somebody asked how to join my mailing list. So I'm just going to put my website in the chat. So if anyone wants to, there'll be a pop-up there. If you go to that website and you can join my mailing list and know about my other teaching and books and things like that. Any thoughts or questions or pushback? I mean, I am just bringing some suggestions. So I'm not here as like the teacher who knows. You're the grandparent. So is there anything that I said that someone wants to sort of offer an opposing perspective or correct me from a grandparent's perspective? I really would welcome that as well. I am an aspiring one day grandparent. Milton asked why there aren't more men participating. I don't know, Milton, any ideas? Gosh, I really wonder if there's a way that, since I know this is being recorded, if the chat could be put together by someone as this beautiful list. It was so moving to me. And I see David's hand is up too.
So so we do record these, by the way, and people will be able to view the recording in the future. We will also copy the chat. What was intriguing to me in your presentation is, when we look at our sources from our Jewish text, we often think about them only in the context of parent and child relationship. And there are only actually two grandparents that we know of in the Bible. One is Jacob and the other is Ruth. But this notion of thinking about these dynamics and how they extend generationally. I love the Kabbalistic perception of when do you say something, when do you not say something. And that's not only a measure of the love of your relationship with your grandchildren, but of your adult children. When do you say something? When do you hold back? And that holding back, we've learned, and by the way, I would probably introduce Ruth Nemzoff, who's on the phone, who's an expert in this area. When we hold that back is often the most profound presentation or of our love, that we're able to hold back and say, you know what, you got this, and we respect you.
That's beautiful.
I see a lovely question in the chat from Patty Gold about should/can a grandparent respond differently to grandchildren when they're in your home without parents, which I think is super interesting, going back to some of the boundaries conversations.
Absolutely. I'm going to let that sit as a question because I certainly don't have the answer to that, but it's a beautiful, important question I think we all probably deal with. Yes, and Miriam is naming, thank you, that today is Yom HaShoah. And so some of the people who are really bringing in grandparents into this consciousness, that people that we've lost collectively and individually, for people in this chat, that we honor their memory.
Ricky, would you want to maybe unmute and talk a little bit about your experiencing grandparenting from afar and how those boundaries maybe shift? Love to hear from you about that.
Hi, because I just have select short times during the week to connect with my grandchildren, and I'm missing out on things. And now that they're getting older, they're having very busy lives, which I want them to have. But it's a different situation than I experienced when my grandparents were around a lot of the time. And it was just very natural and unforced. And especially if you have a child on another coast, it's a long way to hug.
Yeah. Yeah. I live very far from my parents, and that's actually one of the saddest who I'm close to. And I think it's harder for me than for them. And one thing that, is going back to this, I do take some comfort from that. All the way back to Genesis, people were actually traveling and leaving the homes of their parents, and sometimes going really far away and ending up raising children in different places. And I think it is such a modern phenomenon, but it comforts me a little bit that it's also been this part of being human for so long. And I just want to say, in solidarity, I find that really hard too, as a parent.
Well, and for many of us, our grandparents or great-grandparents moved from an entirely different country to come here and never saw their parents again. So at least I can see them.
So I'd like to make a comment to two of the questions raised. One of them was this question about distance. And, like so many things, we can bemoan what we don't have, or we can work with what we've got. And this is a time for incredible creativity. And in our particular age, a chance for the grandchildren to teach us so much technology and different ways that we can interact with them. So is it the same or as good as being there? Probably not, but it can be really creative and interesting. And we can really learn an enormous amount. And then the other question someone had asked, well, it'll come back to me. Oh, I know. It was the question about, do we have different behaviors in our own home in any place or in another home? Well, we know in life you have a million different behaviors. You behave differently in the grocery store, perhaps, than you will at the beach, or so forth and so on. But this is just a wonderful opportunity to talk about it with your kids. When I say the kids, that's the parent age group. So, for example, when my grandchildren were a little bit younger and I would be asked to babysit for them, I'd say, great, I'll take them for the day, no problem. But at 4 o'clock, it's screen time. I need a break. And I said, if you got another activity, that's fine with me, but I really need a break. And we worked that out because she understood that, or they understood that I did need that break and a small price to pay. So that would be an example. But having that different behaviors is one of the things we want to teach our grandchildren. We have different behaviors, just like we have different clothes, different facial expressions.
I think that's so wise, Ruth. And I also just wanted to say something I was thinking before, that, which is that the idea of balancing chesed and gevura, we're talking about it in terms of working with other people, but it works with ourselves too. And it is okay, I think personally, it's just me speaking, I'm not a therapist, but to have boundaries. And I think you're speaking beautifully about that. Like, here is where my energy runs out, or here's what's just not okay in my house. And it's not that I'm saying you're doing things wrong. And it's not that, it's just like, this is my boundary. And like, you are allowed to, I think we're all allowed to have boundaries. And that's part of it too, right? It applies to us. It's not just us adjusting around other people. It's also self-knowledge and kind of graciously accepting who we are and communicating that with other people. So I really appreciate your point, Ruth. Thank you.
Would you like to maybe offer a closing thought or something, and we'll hand it off to David? But this has been just incredible and so lovely, and obviously such rich conversation. So we're so grateful for you and all that you've brought here in this space.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate everyone's beautiful comments and wisdom. And I know that if we had 3 more hours, I'd be hearing even more comments and wisdom from all of you. And I honor each of you for being here, and thank you for grandparenting as a parent. I think we're all in it together, and it's been a joy to be with you this hour.